Our mainstream theories of nationalism, and they're predominantly male theorists, rarely address the question of gender in their work. And what is somewhat surprising here, I think, is that these very same theorists recognize that nationalist movements and nation states, that they draw on their heterogeneous constituencies in very differential ways. So, for example, as members of class or so-called racial or ethnic grouping. The question is sort of, why haven't they, our sort of most predominant theorists of nationalism, why haven't they given much attention to gender in their work? And so as we explore the gendered state, we will come to see that sort of constructions of nationhood often involve very specific notions of manhood and womanhood. And Anne McClintock states the point, I think very emphatically, when she writes that, and I quote her, "All nationalisms are gendered, and all nations depend on powerful constructions of gender." And so it is this idea that will sort of capture our attention today. And before getting into that material, I want to start off today by returning to those famous theorists of nationalism, particularly Gellner and Anderson and Eric Hobsbawm, in order to sort of more fully reflect on the absence of gender and gender analysis in their works. So let's begin first with Gellner, someone we spoke about last time. You're a bit familiar with his work, and you should recall that Gellner centers his analysis on nationalism on the role of this emerging industrial economy. He focuses a lot on institutionalized education and its relationship to the state in achieving this nationalist principle, right, of trying to merge political and ethnic boundaries. And in reading his work, I don't know if you noticed, but he's doing a lot of, for example, reification, in my opinion. For example, economy is often reified in his work, nationalism, culture as well. And of course, by the term reify, I'm sort of referring to the ways he tends to treat, at least I think in my reading of him, certain abstract concepts and notions as if they were sort of concrete things in and of themselves, as if, for example, culture, nationalism, and economy had some sort of material existence. Let me just give you a couple examples. So on page 48 of Nations and Nationalism, Gellner writes, nationalism uses some of the pre-existent cultures, right? And 3 pages later, he refers to high culture with political aspirations. And then on page 140, he explains that, quote, "The economy needs both the new type of central culture and the central state." So this sort of bent towards reification, I find, affords sort of abstract concepts like nationalism, like culture, like economy, sort of an agency of its own, a way of acting sort of in an unfettered manner. And it leads, I think, Gellner to some extent to sort of sidestep in his analysis the human element, the human agent in his nationalist rendition. So to some extent then, Gellner's, I think, is blinding his readers to the fact that people, right, men and women, are advancing nationalist agendas based on particular class, cultural, and of course for our interest today, gendered interests. If we skip over to Anderson, you'll remember that for him, nations are imagined communities, right? In the sense that they represent a sort of method of cultural representation whereby a group of people come to imagine a collective identity through a shared experience and a shared imagination or memory. And this understanding of the nation as a relational construct is really built on a system of difference which does not afford much opportunity, again, to recognize this question of gender. Even Anderson himself makes the observation. He writes on page 5 of Imagined Communities, right at the beginning, that in the modern world, everyone will and should have a nationality as he or she has a gender. But Anderson takes that idea no further, and the remainder of that really important work ignores, for example, the potential significance of gender for nationalism. In a later volume, Anderson even suggests that issues of gender, I quote him, could easily divert attention from the central debate on nations and nationalism, right? And then lastly, there's the famous British historian Eric Hobsbawm, someone who we have read maybe this term. We didn't have that much time to talk so specifically about his work, but he's sort of most recognized for his notion of invented tradition, or the invention of tradition. And in his book, which is called Nations and Nationalism since 1780, he roots nationalism in the French Revolution, and again, his accounting of this history is lacking in a gendered perspective, right? But some years later, Glenda Sluga re-examined Hobsbawm's account of the history of nationalism, but with a focus on gender and national identification in France. And her research found that political philosophers such as Rousseau, for example, made the family central to the relationship between the private and the public order, right? Thereby implicating gender difference in the organization of the nation state. So she explains that shortly after the French Revolution, legislators of the new republic defined national sovereignty in terms of its masculine citizenry, right? And under the Napoleonic Code, for example, male-female relations within the family were central to the authority of the state, and it applied different notions of citizenship to men and women. And so Sluga's analysis leads her to the conclusion that the French Revolution, did indeed inspire the modern nation state, as Hobsbawm argued, but that the characteristics of that nation state included, for example, the firmer delineations of gender. And gender boundaries, of course. She writes, I quote her, ultimately it was in the image of the father and of the patriarchal family that the national community was to mature. So Gellner, Anderson, Hobsbawm, they've obviously made enormous contributions to our understanding of nationalism. And they, along with Anthony Smith, who you've also been reading this term, are indeed probably the most prominent experts in the field. And one of the questions that we should then be considering throughout this sort of tour of the gendered state is, I think, whether their omissions are for a good reason. Remember Anderson's warning that the focus, or a focus on gender, could divert attention from the real issues with regard to nationalism. We need to ask ourselves if we agree with Anderson's position. What do we think? Does a gendered analysis have something significant to contribute to our understanding of nations and nationalism? And there could be some contention here. But what cannot be denied, at least in my opinion, is that gender is indeed activated in relation to national processes. And so as a way to sort of introduce our discussions, let me make a few general comments about the two primary ways that gender seems to resonate with national processes. And the first one is that gender figures prominently in nationalist discourses and ideologies. And by this I mean that sort of the nation is often constructed and imagined in gendered terms. And these constructions figure prominently in nationalist struggles and or nationalist projects. And a good example of this is in India. There's a wealth of scholarship in this regard. So, India has a very long history of nationalism being articulated through gender. So, for example, as Lati Mani has pointed out, in the early 19th century, the notion of womanhood, and in particular the practice of sati, which is this widow burning practice, figured prominently in colonial debates about what might constitute a so-called sort of culturally authentic Indian national identity. And later, in the second half of the 19th century, a sort of new nationalist independent movement was forming in India, and its discourse worked to locate the position of women in this newly emerging nation. Images of the Indian woman as sort of loving, and as a caring mother, and as responsible for national reproduction became really an important component of the nationalist discourse. And then in the 1920s, of course, Mahatma Gandhi also leveraged gendered notions for his nationalist movement. He believed women to possess qualities, I quote Gandhi, of self-sacrifice, silent suffering, humility, faith, and knowledge. And as a result, he drew women and these sort of associated gender constructs into his movement of nonviolence and civil disobedience. And even today in contemporary India, nationalist discourse remains closely linked to gender. We will, or maybe you will, or already have had a chance to look at the work of Joseph Alter. Maybe we'll just speak about it just now with our presenters. But indeed, Alter is talking something about that in relation to really the rise of Hindu nationalism in contemporary India. So examples such as these illustrate quite nicely the nexus between gender and nation in nationalist discourses. However, discourse often translates into action, into state policies, for example, that impacts the everyday lives of state citizenry, the way we come to think about problems and issues, the way we then begin talking about these problems and issues inevitably shapes the ways that we try to act upon them. And herein lies the sort of second main way that gender is implicated in nationalist discourse, rather in nationalist processes. When gendered notions of the nation are translated, for example, into state policies, we find the deployment of gender having sort of much more tangible or material impact. So, for example, policies that relate to women's biological role in reproduction are often the result of nationalist projects. And, for example, their attempts to control or to expand populations in certain parts of the population. Similarly, citizenship and citizenship rights are often tied to very strict gendered notions. And today we should be looking at some, for example, gendered national policies through case studies in both Israel and Cyprus. And I'm sure we will get a chance to get a sense of how these sorts of ideas about gender and nationalism translate into policy and then actually into real lived everyday impacts on people's lives. So I guess by way of conclusion, I just want to make one more point, maybe in an explicit fashion. I mean, when we speak about gender, we often have this tendency of thinking only about, women. And I imagine that many of you might think, and sometimes the literature points in that way, that a gendered analysis of the nation and state sort of tells us something about women in relation to the nation. But despite the examples I gave, that's not true. Gendered notions about men and manhood and fatherhood are also very much implicated in nations and nationalism and national discourses and national policies as well. So we're going to focus on that as well, I think, if our presenters take us that way. In particular, we also want to think about what Wendy Brown calls finding the man in the state, because that's also very central to our thinking and discussions on this topic of gendered nations and gendered nationalisms.